Great, thanks so much. Yeah, as far as questions go, I'm happy to take them and feel free to interrupt as we go. And if it's something that I think I'll get to later, I'll just say that and we'll get to that. So here's the basic structure for the talk. I'm going to start out by talking a bit about who cares about parenting, and then I'll talk about sort of gaps by family socioeconomic status and a sense of parenting, and one way that we measure that using a consumer expenditure survey. Then I'll make an argument for something that I think we don't know very well, which is the extent to which these gaps are driven by parenting logics versus resources. I'll talk then about how others have tried to measure these logics, how then we measure these logics, whether what we measure actually varies by SCS, and then the implications of this for understanding SCS gaps in intensive parenting. So, as a disclosure, as you probably can see, I'm in the United States. I'm actually in Colorado, which is like right in the center of this picture, where it is currently 6:30 in the morning. Um, so the work I'm doing is primarily, or is and based on research that is in the U.S. The data happens from the U.S. And so that's my context. I do, of course, understand that there are parents and scholars throughout the world. And the extent to which that what I find could be similar or different across other country contexts is definitely something that I think is really interesting, and we could talk about at the end. Anyway, but I just want to be clear where I'm coming from. So when I talk about like parents do this or we find this about parents, just sort of know where I'm coming from. Okay. So parenting's been a hot topic in both public and academic discourse. I think that's really been amplified since the pandemic. We've come up with all kinds of terms to describe this parenting, like intensive parenting and helicopter parenting and tiger parenting and free range parenting. I just read an article about something called lighthouse parenting. And if you don't know what kind of parent you are, that's okay. BuzzFeed is there for you. You can take a quiz that will tell you what kind of parent you are or what kind of parent you will be. So, depending on who you're talking to, these different types of parenting can be good or they can be bad. They can have too much involvement. They can have too little involvement. And I think nothing really captures this sort of collective confusion about parenting than The Atlantic, which is a sort of influential magazine in the US. They ran this article, How to Quit Intensive Parenting, and then just a couple months later, stop pretending that intensive parenting doesn't work. So why do we care about this? So I think implied in this discourse is that parenting is a critical part of shaping children's outcomes, things like their human and cultural capital, their educational achievement, social well-being, and ultimately later life career attainment. So in this way, parenting is a key mechanism alongside, other mechanisms like schools and neighborhoods for shaping intergenerational mobility. So within sociology, the dominant framework of at least US parenting comes from the ethnographic work of Ned LaRoe, who broadly offered two approaches for raising children. So one type she called considered cultivation, and this was all about drawing out children's talents and skills by engaging in this highly intensive parenting and investing time and energy into children. And this approach is associated with middle and upper class families and in some later research, white families. And then the alternative to this was the accomplishment of natural growth. This approach was less intensive, with children given much more freedom to manage their own time. And this was associated with working class and poor and non-white families. And subsequent research, both qualitative and quantitative, I think is really largely built on this framework, whether testing, refining, extending, or critiquing it. And so if we look at data, we can see this evidence of intensive parenting. Sharon Hayes talked about this concept in her book in 1996, The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood, which I think is a very influential book from the 1990s. And I think sort of these, sort of the beginning of these concerns about parenting. So there are, of course, a lot of ways that we can measure this. One way that I've looked at it is through parental spending. So what I'll just show you in the next picture, I'm using the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a quarterly nationally representative household survey of spending in the US. It measures lots of different categories, but what I'll just show you is something that we call parental investments, which is the per child spending on developmental activities, which includes things like schooling, tutoring, lessons, extracurriculars, and childcare. And these, of course, in real dollars. So what we can see is that over time, right, parents are investing more money in their children. So in roughly 4 decades, right, the total amount of spending per child has roughly roughly doubled. But at the same time, we know these increases aren't realized across the entire distribution. So if we break this down by income, right, we can see, so the yellow line is the top 10% of income earners. The green line is the next 15%. The red line is those from 50 to 75%. And the blue line at the bottom is the bottom half of the income distribution. And so we can really see two things. One, of course, is a difference in the level. So perhaps unsurprisingly, those with higher incomes spend more per child than those who are lower. And then we can see that most of the increase has been realized by those near the top of the income distribution. So I've worked on these parental investments a lot. I have papers looking at how parental investments and this rise is related to income inequality, to family structure, looking at these differences by race and ethnicity. I have a paper looking at how this varies by seasonality, so parental spending during the summer versus during the school year, and then most recently how this was affected during COVID. Which, if you want to know, if you just look at sort of 2020-ish in the picture and the dip in the yellow line, that's basically the COVID effect. Um, we can also look at this by education. So if we look at by education, we see some differences, but again, we see very large differences by education. The yellow line on top is families where at least one parent has a bachelor's degree. The green line is high school completion, and the red line is not. So we see sort of the same inequalities by education. There's less of an increase over time. Part of it could be sort of real. Part of it also just note this figure is starting in 1997. And the figure I showed you earlier started in 1980, which is cutting off a lot of when the increase happened. There's other ways we can measure intensive parenting too. Scholars have done it measuring it using time with children. And so we know that parents are spending more time with their children than before. We know that higher SES parents spend more time than lower SES parents. The changes in the differences by SES over time are a bit less clear. And then we can also think about it with measures of activities. And again, the pattern is that there's more activity, and this is especially by families with more income and more education. Okay, so with that background, right, the question I would then want to ask is why does this parenting vary by socioeconomic status? And so what I want to make an argument for is that it's unclear the extent to which these findings, right, reflect different cultural logics about what makes for good parenting, or they just reflect differences in the resources that be required to enact the parenting styles that parents think would be best. So by logics, I include things that sociologists have called strategies, philosophies, values, and orientations for good parenting. And then by resources, I of course mean economic resources, but also things like time and social capital and anything that could be used for parenting or the lack thereof might constrain parenting choices. So just to sort of flesh this out, right, so we can sort of imagine this little toy diagram, right? So we have both parenting logics and parenting resources, and both of these can affect the actual parenting practices that parents have. And these things can be, of course, related to each other or not. That's part of the project here. But I do want to sort of make a case to think about these can be distinct things. So we can just sort of imagine two examples, right? So one is you can have two families that both want their child to play the violin. So this is the same logics, but only one can afford the instrument and the lessons. They have different resources. And so the net result is that one child learns the violin and the other one doesn't. So different outcomes. In the second example, right, two families could both afford the violin and lessons, so they have the same resources, but only one thinks that it's important for the child to learn. So this is different logics. And so again, we get the same result of different outcomes, but for a different reason. So if we really want to try to tease some of this apart, right, we already measure parenting resources with things like income and wealth and poverty status and education and occupation and sort of everything that's the bread and butter of social stratification research. I think the much more challenging thing is to think about how do we measure the logics apart from just measuring what people do. So I'm going to talk, I mean, we're not the first people to think about this, so I'm going to talk about a few different ways that others have tried to look at this, either explicitly or implicitly. And so I'll highlight this and then also maybe point out some of the limitations of this work. Qualitative ethnographic interview studies have focused on how parents explain their parenting, right? The seminal work of Net LaRoe found that both middle and working class families stated that they thought that their type of parenting was preferable. So this would suggest that the differences in the actual parenting practices would be due to differences in cultural logics. On the other hand, other qualitative work has found that parents express very similar desires to help children cultivate skills and talents, which then might suggest the differences are actually due to differences in the resources the parents have. Just an example of this approach to research, a recent ASR paper by Ali Rao examined how fathers and mothers who lose a job, right, discuss and explain how this affects their decisions about spending on children. This has been really important influential work, but we know that it can be really difficult for people to separate describing the motivation versus the justification for their behaviors, right, including presumably their parenting practices. A second approach has been to do quantitative work, particularly analyzing survey data. And so in this approach, typically what happens is that we control for different types of resources, things like income and work hours, and then focuses on differences in parenting practices by some other characteristic. That's usually been education, but it could also be done by family structure or by race. So this has been done in work looking at parental estimates of time, and then my own work looking at parental estimates of money. This is exactly the approach that I've used lots of times. So of course, I think this approach is really valuable, but some important limitations here, right, is that the logics themselves are not directly observed, right? And we could think about something like parental education could actually be a proxy for other resources like skills and social capital that could lead to the adoption of different parenting practices. Uh, a third approach has been content analysis. I think the best known example of this is this paper from Julia Wrigley, which is now sort of over 30 years old, where they hand-coded articles from U.S. parenting magazines from 1900 to 1985 to document changes in attitudes towards the intellectual development of children and the increasing value of formal education. Similarly, Linda Quirk has done extensive analysis of Canadian parenting magazines. And in Sharon Hayes' book, she looked at parenting manuals. So, this, of course, has limitations too, right? In particular, it doesn't tell us the extent to which these logics are actually held by parents rather than the experts who wrote the articles or manuals, right? Nor does it provide insights in whether the parenting logics might differ by class or by race. And then a fourth approach to talk about is a survey experiment. This study is actually really important to the study that I'm going to present. So, but basically, parents who were the respondents were given hypothetical parenting behaviors. These behaviors are either what we might think of as considered cultivation behaviors or natural growth behaviors. And so the study was done by Patrick Shizuka, and what he found was that parents consistently rated higher the considered cultivation parenting, regardless of the respondent's own race or class. And so based on this, he concluded that what most parents want is considered cultivation, which might then suggest that parenting logics are similar and the differences in behaviors are actually due to differences in resources. Of course, an important limitation here is that this approach adopts the predefined parenting style categories of considered cultivation and natural growth, which were themselves originally inferred from parenting behaviors, which is sort of the thing we're trying to get at explaining in the first place. So we're going to try to add to this using computational text analysis. I think for this audience, I'm probably one of the least qualified people to talk about computational text analysis, but as we all know, this has become increasingly more common, right, as methods have evolved and the data has become more readily available. And these tools have been used to measure various aspects of culture, including, so they work well for what we're trying to do here. And in particular, we'll use topic modeling, which is an unsupervised machine learning pattern for identifying systemic patterns in text. All right, so what I'm going to present from here going forward until we sort of get to the next steps is a published paper, which came out last year in social science research with my collaborator, Luca Maria Passando. That said, as you'll see, this certainly isn't meant to be the final word on anything, and hopefully it's the first of several papers. So with that said, I would still really welcome your suggestions and your questions, though I guess I welcome your citations too, if you want. So, what I want to do now is have you take a minute to think about this. Usually I give this talk in person and I make the audience discuss it, but I won't do it here. But just take 30 seconds and think about this. Summer's ended, school year's just started. Angela's 9-year-old son complains that he's been feeling bored after school. How would you advise Angela to respond in this situation? Just think about it for a few seconds while I get a drink, and then we'll keep going. Okay, hopefully you thought about it for a second. Yeah, so whatever you thought about, right? The reason we do this is because that's basically the type of data that we're analyzing in this study. So what it was is a nationally representative online survey where parents gave open-ended advice. So this came from the study by Patrick Yoshizuka. But before he got to the experimental part, where he gave sort of hypothetical parenting behaviors and had this that people rate them, right? They had a question, which is what kind of advice would you give in this situation? So we're analyzing three everyday parenting situations across three domains of daily life. The first one was one you just thought about, that was since we're after school. A second one we have, it's late on a school night. David repeatedly tells his daughter it's bedtime. David's daughter yells, I hate your rules, they're so unfair. How would you advise David to respond? And then the third one, Kevin's daughter's diagnosed with asthma. The doctor says medication might help. Kevin's daughter says, I don't want to take medicine. How would you advise Kevin to respond? So we analyze all three in the paper. For the talk here, I'll just go through two of them, which I think sort of captures most of the variation. And to be clear, the name of the parent was randomized for both mother's and father's names, and then so was the gender of the child. So I'm just showing you examples here. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's the column of the ends. To be clear, so each respondent only received one of the situations in the study. So they're ends, but these are different people in each of the studies, which is something we can also talk about at the end. So here are types of examples, answers that people gave. Find something for us to get involved in. Sports scouts from the organization. This is a situation that you just thought about. Another one, I would ask her to explain what she means by bored. Is it a lack of games, TV, radio, activities, or what? Once that was determined, I would see if we could reach a resolution. So the mean length of these responses was 20 words. The median was 16 words. And then other variables we have to analyze the data come from the survey itself. So we have the respondents' race, ethnicity, their education, their income, their age, and their gender. So why is this the data we want to analyze? So we're analyzing open-ended parenting advice about hypothetical situations from a nationally representative survey. So the idea here is that because it's open-ended, right, it's unconstrained by any pre-existing categories of considered cultivation or natural growth. Because we're looking at advice, we're arguing we think we're coming a little closer to capturing parenting logics because there's a lot fewer constraints imposed on resources that you would have for behaviors. So whether or not that my child is learning violin, right, I can recommend that someone else does it um, if I think it's a good idea. And then because it's a national example, it's hopefully generalizable to some extent. But it still is an online survey, but so take that for what it's worth. All right, so just to sort of summarize the methods here, we are going to pre-process the text in pretty standard ways, taking out stop words, punctuation, all the words in the prompt itself, which people tend to repeat. And then we do some stemming. Then we're going to use Biterm topic models, which generate topics using word-word co-occurrence patterns. And this should work better for short text like we have here. We determine the number of topics and ultimately settle on four, and then we'll interpret them. And then finally, what we'll do is we'll examine whether there are differences in the parenting logics that we have inferred based on the respondents' race, ethnicity, income, and education. I realize that race ethnicity is not a measure of socioeconomic status, which is how I build the talk, but we do it in the paper, so you get that for free. Okay, so we're going to do that second part later, and we're just going to start by doing the text analysis. Yeah, so what's a topic model? Many of you can probably explain this better than me, but I'll just give the very short summary, right? Which is that, we can think of each respondent's advice as a document. We make this bag of words assumption that the order of the words isn't important. We choose a number of topics, which we'll talk about in a second. And we assume that each document is a mixture of each. Then we assign sort of a randomly every word to a topic. Then there's an iterative Bayesian technique to reassign words across topics until the best fit's achieved, right? And the best solution is one where the documents with similar word distributions are assigned similarly to different topics. Um, this conventional model and popular variants of it, like structural topic modeling, don't work that well for short documents. So instead, we'll be using something called the Biterm Topic Model. And so this will use word co-occurrence patterns, which we call biterms, within the entire set of the documents. So this has been previously used in applications where you have short texts, like examining tweets or whatever they're called now on X. And then for open-ended survey responses, which is exactly what we have here. So just to think about what this looks like in the data, right? So here's some original quotes. These come from the Take Your Medicine one, right? So, we start with, tell him it's going to make him feel better, or slip him the meds without him knowing. This is the child who doesn't want to take the medicine. Or another one, talk to your son to determine his reason for posing it, to determine if he can be swayed. So we clean this up to get the keywords. And then from that, we generate the pairwise combinations of words just at the byte terms, which we can see on the right-hand side. So for selecting the number of topics, right, the goal is to capture the variation across documents, but avoid creating so many topics that it's not useful or interpretable. We also have some quantitative guides for this, things we call exclusivity and semantic coherence. If we're expecting that the parenting styles out there are reflecting parenting logics, then we might expect there to be two topics that align well with considered cultivation and the accomplishment of natural growth. So we tested this. The two-topic model did not perform well by neither quantitative metrics nor human interpretability. We ended up settling on four topics, which we thought provided a parsimonious but interpretable model. Um, I have backup slides on this if we want to get into it. I do want to emphasize though that I wouldn't argue that there may not be a best K, right? So models with few topics could capture more generalized parenting logics, right? While topics with many or models of many topics could capture sort of specific nuances within that. And then the last step is to interpret our models. So we do this in a few ways, right? We examine the keywords within each topic. Then we read all the responses that belonged with a very high probability to that topic. And then we sort of read a random sample of other responses that had a higher probability of being in that topic. And then based on that, we developed summary labels and descriptions for each topic. So we'll go into the results. So yeah, so interpreting the results in the topic models, right? Nearly all the topics we felt were consistent with some version of intensive parenting. But with that, we felt like there were two additional axes that emerged. So one was that the advice that parents gave was either very pedagogic, like this is a learning opportunity with my child, or pragmatic, like how can we efficiently get to the best outcome? And then the second was the advice was either assertive, like tell the child what would be good for them, or it was negotiated. This is something we need to work out and go back and forth on. So I'll give you examples of this across the different topics. So here are examples from the board after school scenario, which was the first one that you thought about. Obviously, there's no order to these, so I'm just going to go through them in the order from most frequent to least frequent. So the first one we described as both pragmatic and assertive, right? An example of that, find something for our son to get involved in, sports, scouts, or another organization. The second is pragmatic but less assertive. Go over with your son different options of things he can do after school. Stay with her daughter and create a list of things she can do. The third was pragmatic, but even more negotiated. Ask for examples of what's making her bored. Ask what activities she'd like to do better. And then the fourth one was more pedagogic and negotiated, which says really this exchange and discussion. Examples of this, Angela should open up a conversation with her son and see why he feels that way. Or I would ask her to explain what she means by bored. Is it lack of games, TV, radio activities, or what? Once that was determined, I would see if we could reach a resolution. If we look at this with the taking your medicine scenario, remember the child is being asked to take medicine and does not want to. So the most prevalent one here we call pedagogic but assertive, right? So it seems a learning moment, but there's no question like what the outcome should be, right? So tell the son the benefits of taking medicine, make sure he knows the medicine wouldn't harm him. Then one that's much more pragmatic but also assertive. So it gets the job done, right? Slip him the meds without him knowing. Give a reward if she takes the med without a fight. The third is much more negotiated. The outcome seems a little less clear, right? There's a number of things we could do. Medicine's one of those. We can try other things if you're willing to try it first. If you want to maintain an active lifestyle, you might have to consider it. And then fourth one that's pedagogic and negotiated. Yes, there's an exchange and discussion here, right? So I would let him know the negatives of his decision. Tell him he needs to use the medicine because we love him and don't want him to experience the negatives. Why should a child be limited by their own experiences and mistakes? The parent can share their personal experiences in hopes to deter ignorant decisions by an uneducated child. So we take all these and do it for the other scenario as well. And we can place all these back on our diagram, which we do here, to sort of capture the variation across the different dimensions. To be clear here, this is a super stylized assessment based on our read of it, right? So there's no units to these axes, at least not yet. So then the question is, right, do these parenting logics that we measure vary across different socioeconomic groups? So to look at this, right, let's go back and think about now what the data look like. So we could think about sort of each row here as being a person, right? So the topics that we inferred from the model, right, are the columns in the green, right? And so there's a proportionate assignment of topics for each individual. So imagine here, so the first row, person 33, right? They're 8% topic one, 1% topic two, 1% topic three, 90% topic four. So really sort of a topic four response. That person's in the bottom, the first income quartile, which we have coded as the bottom. They have a high school education and they're white, non-Hispanic. Right, the second row, right? So that person, they're 34% topic one, 1% topic two, 0% topic three, 65% topic four. So topic four is still sort of the winner here, but also a high possibility of being in topic one. Right, and then this person is in the top income quartile. They also have a high school education and they're Hispanic, right? And we do this so forth. So if we think about what we really want to do here, right, is we want to see if the characteristics of the individual, which were the columns in the sort of orange yellow, right, we want to see if those can predict, right, which topic that someone's in. So basically, what's in the green. If we think about what the green columns represent, right, it's really a single categorical variable. But instead of a person belonging like to one of the categories, right, they belong sort of proportionally to different categories, but the sum of the categories adds up to one. So the way that we'll analyze this is with a fractional multinomial logit model. So it's like multinomial logistic regression, except instead of an outcome where you belong like to a single one of the categories, right? The outcome's a set of proportional variables that adds up to one. The dependent variable is the categorical variable, where the category is the probability of a device belonging to each topic. Our key independent variables are race, ethnicity, education, income, which we examine both together and separately. We get quite similar results both ways. I'll just present the results with them together. And then we'll control for respondent's age and the gender of the parent and the child in the specific parenting situation. And then the models include post-stratification weights and are estimated with robust standard errors. Okay, so here's some results. Again, this is the board after school scenario. So each line represents one of the topics. The fact that some lines are higher than other lines just reflects the fact that some topics are more prevalent than others, right? If we expect to see a lot of variation across social groups, then what we should see is that the lines go up and down. If we sort of step back from our computer and look at the screen, right, what we really see is the lines are fairly flat, right? So the pragmatic logic is slightly more prevalent among whites and the non-poor, and these are statistically significant. But overall, we see fairly weak differences by race, income, and especially education. And similarly, if we look at the take your medicine scenario, again, we see fairly flat lines, right? The pedagogic assertive logic is slightly more prevalent among non-Hispanic Blacks and the lowest income group. But overall, we see fairly weak differences by race, education, and income. So what's our takeaway from this? I'll summarize it this way, right? So the existing literature, on parenting is rooted in this dichotomization of parenting approaches. Where these approaches include both, these also include people's actions and behaviors, right? And then what we find is these approaches differ by class and sometimes race. What we find is that the parenting logics don't appear to be captured with this binary categorization. And so instead, we find dimensions of variation, this pragmatic versus pedagogic logic, and assertive versus negotiated logics is not central to the existing literature. And instead, we find much more similarity in parenting logics across groups, and more variation within groups than is commonly understood based on prior parenting research. So even though we're saying this is sort of a surprise, this is actually completely consistent with Patrick Ishizuka's work that found that race and class were not predictive of other people's predictive evaluations of, were not predictive of people's evaluations of parenting. And it's also consistent with Ali Rao's approach of focusing on key variations in parenting within a single social group. And then I think this also shows us how computational methods can complement the use of more traditional research methods in answering fairly traditional research questions. So then, yeah, so next steps from here, right? So there's a few ways we've thought about this. So one is that perhaps we need more data, right? In particular, we might think we want different situations that maybe capture more of the things we care about when it comes to things like social mobility and stratification. What we'd also really like is to have parents provide advice to multiple situations, right? And so this could sort of look for the durability of the parenting logics across contexts, right? If these things are real, we might expect that the advice you give in one situation ought to be predictive of the advice that you would give in a different situation. We've also thought about ways to get longer responses. Sort of one of the limitations of the approach is that the responses aren't that long, and so it'd be nice to have more there. And then we also think maybe, there's not variation in the variables that we looked at, right? But there's other things that maybe is where the variation occurs. So maybe it's something about like region or state or family structure or the number and ages of the children you have or the occupation of the parent. And then we're also interested in seeing how sort of our parenting logics map onto some of the items from the parenting styles scales that come from psychology. So we actually have some pilot data on this that I collected from Prolific and MTurk. And then my collaborator, Luca Maria Passando, has also done a similar study collecting data from this from parents in the United Arab Emirates, which we compared to. Another thought is we can use more methods, right? In particular, right, so the topic modeling approach is just using the words that occur in the data collected. And especially because these responses are quite short, we might think that approaches that are using like models trained on vocabularies outside of the data that we have might be more useful. So this could be things like, the bird topic approach, or of course, large language models. And then we could also think about how these results might be similar or different to comparing it if we had actually just qualitatively coded the same responses. In the big picture, right, I've also thought about how other ways we can use computational text analysis to examine, other sources to look at discussions about parenting, things like what parenting parents should do for their kids, what good parenting looks like. One way I've looked at this is currently looking at subreddits. So there's a subreddit that's dedicated to people actually asking for parenting advice. It's actually very similar to the situation we just talked to. You can see some situations here, like, so someone goes on, they ask a question, like, would you allow your 17-year-old kids to go on a school trip to Saudi Arabia? Or should I let my daughter miss school for an event? Or my daughter lie to daycare? People ask a question, and then as you can see, like lots of people respond and give lots of different answers. So that's a source of sort of real text of parenting advice. The way that we've used it so far is comparing the usage of this before to after during the pandemic, right? And sort of as people were trying to navigate through the brave new world of parenting during the pandemic. Beyond that, we've also thought about cross-national comparisons. So I actually just did a sabbatical in Europe in the fall and presented this work. And so in sort of every country that I went, people were very interested in talking about sort of how the results might be different in their country context in the US. And so that's something I'm very interested in exploring more, and something you also might have thoughts about from your own context. And then in sort of the biggest picture, right, ideally what we could do is we could measure parenting logics and parenting practices, things like their actions and behaviors, their parental investments, right, for the same people. And that way we could study the link or the lack thereof between the two. I think there's a lot of methodological challenges to this. One thought is I think we need separate surveys to sort of reduce the priming bias, where parents' responses about their actions might bias their answers about their beliefs, or and vice versa. But if we could get this right, then we could really look at the connections or inconsistencies between actions and beliefs, which we definitely might also think are patterned by socioeconomic status. And then ultimately, right, this helps us understand how resources and logics can shape parenting behavior and inequalities in opportunities and outcomes for children. So, that's what I have. I look forward to having a discussion, but if you have anything else to say, please don't hesitate to email me. And then the research I showed you for the computational next text analysis is in a paper, which is here. And then on my website, there's a full replication package for it. And you can have a look at that as well as it's got my other papers on parental investments. So thanks.